Okay, so hello, my name is Cayo Pilogajetis. We're at the St. George Clifton Church today, doing an oral history interview about your Greek American experience, your family's experiences, and how that's influenced your life. So if you'd like to start off by stating your name, that'd be great.
Hello, my name is Nick Dessipris. My father's family comes from a small island in the Cyclades. It's called Dinos. It's very close to Mykonos. He was one of 14 children, the only to come over to the United States. Out of 14 children, seven survived and seven died as children. Back then, they didn't have medicine, they were very poor, so 50% of the children didn't survive.
Okay, awesome. So let's talk about. So you mentioned where your family was originally from. So what do you know about the place specifically? Dinos.
Dinos is a small island. It's a very religious island where they have a church for the Virgin Mary. So Dinos is a small island, about half hour by boat from the island of Mykonos, which is more well known. It's a very religious island. It's not big on tourism. It's mostly for religious Greeks that come to see the church that has been built for the Virgin Mary. The population is between, at different times of the year, between 5 and 8,000 people. Um, there's a lot of fishing, a lot of tourism.
Okay, so I just have a question in terms of, and we'll get back to your father's story because I think it's very interesting. So you've obviously gone back to Tino several times and got to experience the life of being in Tinos and having that small island life with the tourism of being in Panagias. Um, do you think that your experience would have been different? Say you were from Rodos, that's like very fast paced, very energized, and always on the go. Whereas Dino is basically you go there just to visit Panagias.
It's definitely been affected by that because it's made me a more religious person for sure, and it's brought me closer to my family. Where as if I went to someplace like Rhodos or Santorini or Mykonos, I would have been concentrating on partying instead of forming a closer bond with my family, which is the case now. So Dinos is very special, holds a very special place in my heart. Um, I have traveled to other parts of Greece and I enjoy all of it, but Dinos is a very sacred place.
Okay, good. So how do you think having Panagia there is do you feel like that is a constant reminder of your religion, especially being from Dino and having that be kind of the centerpiece of Dino, if I'm not mistaken?
Well, Banaya keeps affecting my life because when I was ready to get married, I asked for, I went to the church and I prayed and I asked for a sign that I would know who the right person was to marry. And that's how I married my wife. So it's a very big part of my life, yes.
Awesome. That's really cool. Okay, so we've talked about your knowledge of the place and having visited Dino. So how did you learn about the stories of your family, and do you have any stories that you'd like to share about those experiences?
We should repeat those.
Okay, you can share
Yeah.
whatever you'd like.
Let's see, what story can I possibly tell that wouldn't sound like a crazy Greek story? Oh, jeez. Oh my God.
Take your time.
They're gonna think we're barbarians.
No, that's okay. I'm sure they.
Is this recording right now?
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
I can edit this out.
Oh my goodness. What story can I tell that is not doesn't sound barbaric? Um. All right, I could. Um. So, okay, I'll say it. All right.
Okay.
Are we still recording?
Yeah.
Okay, you're gonna hit it.
Yeah. I will. I promise.
Unfortunately, when I was 11 years old was the last time I had been in Greece, and I didn't get to return for 20 years because when my grandfather, my papu, died, my father's siblings all started fighting over the inheritance, and they divided amongst themselves property and money. And my father, living here in the United States, never saw a penny of it, and he never forgave them. So he vowed he would never talk to his brothers and sisters again. So at the age of 30, I decided I wanted to see my cousins, and that my cousins and I had nothing to do with what was between our parents. And it was the best decision I ever made. I got back to my roots and got super close with my cousins to this day. I love them to death, and we're very close. And now our children play together and communicate, and it's been the greatest thing that I ever did, and it led to many beautiful things. It's
Awesome. So your father was originally from Greece, right? What can you share about what life was like for them, being there, I guess, and then coming over and their life again here and having to take that transition on?
Well, when my father was 13, the island was very poor. They had been through Turkish wars and the war with Germany and Italy. Uh, Dinos is special in Greece because Dinos and Syros, which is the main island of the Kykladas, the Cyclades, are 50% Roman Catholic and 50% Greek Orthodox, where the rest of Greece is all Orthodox. That's because of the Venetian Empire that was there for 500 years. But the Greek Roman Catholics and the Greek Orthodox intermarry and they get along very well. They consider themselves brothers and sisters, and it's the only place in Greece where those two religions live in harmony. I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about? Oh, when my father was around 13, he decided to leave because they were very poor and they were supporting many children. And him being the man, decided to try to venture out and send money back to help support his family. So he became a seaman. There was a man on the island that owned ships, a shipping company, and he took my father on and kind of adopted him when he was 13. My father ended up traveling to places like Japan and Cuba and South America, where he met many people and learned many things. Sent money back so his sisters could get married. He bought his parents a house. That's why he was so hurt when, in the end, he didn't get any of the inheritance after he had helped everyone. But since he lived in America, they thought he must be rich because here the roads are paved in gold. So basically, that's what happened. But he also left Dinos because they were trying to make him. In those days, there were arranged marriages, and they were trying to make him marry um, a short, fat woman with a mustache, and he wasn't going to go for that.
So, when he got here, I'm not sure if you know, but do you know if it was difficult for him to get here in terms of legalities? Like, did he have trouble crossing the border, I guess, almost in a sense? Um,
Because of the fact that he was working for someone that owned a shipping company, the guy had a lot of connections. My father by then had learned a lot of different languages. He spoke several, and the paperwork was arranged, and he was allowed into the United States, but he told me he was driving for several years before he actually had a driver's license. So back then, things were not as strict as they are now.
Mhm.
A lot of people, there were stowaways on boats, and people were living here for years and without licenses or anything else, and they weren't as strict back then.
Mhm. Cool. So once he was here and had the ability to kind of move around, what was his? Because he worked as a seaman. Did he stay a seaman when he was here in the United States, or was he, working as something else?
Once he got tired of the sea, he decided he wanted to open a diner. Big surprise. And he first got a job as a dishwasher in a diner that was in Penn Station, New York. And he would take 3 buses from New Jersey every morning and come home late at night. And eventually he saved up enough money to buy his first diner on Broad Street in Newark, New Jersey. And we actually lived through the riots of 1967, where the African Americans burned down um, most of Newark. And the only structure that was still standing on Broad Street in Newark was my father's diner because he let all the policemen drink coffee for free and they protected it. So it
Um.
finally paid off.
So what diner was that?
It was called um, City Hall Restaurant.
And it's obviously not there today.
No, I think it's a Dunkin' Donuts now.
Okay. Interesting.
It was right next to City Hall.
Makes sense. So I'm assuming that you were a young boy when the Newark riots were happening. So you were living in Newark. When these riots were basically going outside. So what do you remember about these riots?
I was about 4 years old and I was inside the diner looking through the glass window while the National Guard was hitting with clubs the African Americans, and I saw taxi cabs being tipped over and all kinds of things. And I asked my father what was going on because I was a little kid, and he said, "Don't worry about it, it's a parade." Typical Greek response.
Yeah.
He said, "Just don't tell your mama about it."
Wow. Okay. That's definitely interesting. And why do you think? I mean, obviously you were a child, but why do you think that might have been easier for him to say that rather than actually what was going on?
Um, my father had been through so much hardship in his life as a kid that I think he started to see everything as not a big deal. And this
Mm-hmm.
was just another not a big deal. And that's the way he raised me, to basically be fearless. And made quite a story for himself in Newark. The the policemen and detectives used to joke about him because if someone didn't pay what they owed him and they tried to leave without paying, he would basically chase them down Broad Street in Newark with a big butcher knife. And usually they were twice his size, and he had an apron on. So the detectives used to sit in their cars and just watch him and tell stories about him and say, "Your father's a real nut."
It's really funny.
So I kind of idolized my father when I was a kid because I thought he was Superman.
Oh my gosh.
He used to walk around with a gun, and back then they were easier to get. And if he saw anybody picking on the elderly or trying to rob anybody, he would jump out of the station wagon and chase them down the street with his gun. He thought he was a policeman, a savior. I don't know what he thought he was, but he used to smack kids in the face if they were smoking cigarettes because he said they were too young. He didn't realize that he wasn't still in Greece and he just couldn't walk up to strangers and slap them in the face. So my mom was constantly yelling at him and telling him, "You have to stop doing that. They're going to put you in jail one day."
Oh my gosh.
But everyone was so used to him. He was just John the Greek, so he's okay. Don't worry about him.
It's really cool. So before we get into kind of your background, is there anything else about their experiences, even we haven't really talked about your mother, but in general, their experiences that you'd like to share that you've thought about.
Um, my father, I think, was trying to devise a way to become an American citizen, and my mom was an American citizen. And I'm not saying that's the only reason he married her because she was very attractive also. But I think at that time he was a survivor and he was always looking for a way to better himself and to have a better life. And I think that that might be one of the reasons why he married my mom. And he met her at a port when he was a seaman, and then he got tired of that life, and he just wanted to live in the United States and live the American dream. He once said to me when he was coming in on the ship that he thought that the Statue of Liberty was waving to him and saying welcome. But he said years after being in this country and going through all kinds of things in a different culture and in many ways learning many bad things like gambling and just being around people with a lot of money and power that he didn't know from a small village, which helped him lose his way. He said he realized several years later that the Statue of Liberty was actually saying, "Stop, go back. You're making a big mistake."
Wow, that's really awesome. That's really
He
crazy.
lost his roots, and in that he lost himself. And 18 years later, my parents ended up divorcing because he was cheating on her and gambling and hanging out with organized crime and just became a very completely different person from the person, the innocent person he was when he started all this when he was a kid. And I just buried him in November of last year after not seeing him for 15 years because he disappeared out of my life. And luckily, he had a small piece of paper in his wallet that had my name and phone number on it, and they found it at the hospital and called me and told me that he had dementia, and I spent the last 6 months with him before he passed away, and that was my closure.
Wow, that's crazy. I'm sorry. It's
And I'm
awful.
very thankful for that closure.
Awesome.
I realized later on in life, there was a period he lived with me when I was in my 30s for 2 years in my apartment because they were knocking down his building in Newark to make condominiums.
Hmm.
And he came to live with me temporarily. And I realized that the man I had idolized my whole life was not someone that I wanted to be anything like. And I thank God that I had that chance to see that so that I changed my ways and ended up going back to my family in Greece and finding my roots and my church and marrying a good woman and raising wonderful children.
Um, I just have one question. So you said that he was involved in organized crime, and some of the interviewers that I've talked to have talked about similar organized crime. And I'm not trying to make a generalization. This is just an assumption. But do you think that coming over, being Greek, had anything to do with his influence in being involved in organized crime, or do you think it just happened because he was living in Newark and was, I mean, there's like heavy gangs.
Both. I think that there were a lot of Italians here that were involved in organized crime in places like New York and Newark at that time. And when the Greeks came over here, the people that they felt most familiar with were the Italians before any other nationality. And they ended up getting involved in uh, getting loans to open up diners from organized crime, going gambling together, and because of the similar cultures and the need of borrowing money to open up diners, I think that that kind of intertwined the path of the two nationalities at that time.
Nice. Interesting. Okay, so now we're gonna flip it a little bit and kind of talk about your specific experience because we've talked a lot about your parents, which is great. Um, so you're Greek Orthodox, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So how has that influenced your life as a child growing up, being in the Greek Orthodox faith, and now continuing having your own family?
I did not truly become, even though I was religious my whole life since I was a child, maybe because of the trauma in my family, the constant trauma. I always felt close to God, and I always talked about God when my other friends weren't really into God, but I never really went to church. Not until I was around late 20s to early 30s did I start feeling the urge and the pull to come back to the church. And that's when I met my wife. I actually took a 2 year sabbatical from women before I met my wife. And I made this contract with God that if I cleansed myself for 2 years, that He would find me a nice woman to marry. And it worked out very well. We actually met in Costa Rica when we were both on vacation.
Hmm, that's really cool. Wow. Um, so how did this is another question now? How did religion play a role in your understanding of your Greek heritage?
If it wasn't for my Greek Orthodox background, I don't think I would have survived my childhood. I literally don't think. I have many friends that I grew up with that either OD'd, went to jail, or are drug addicts now. The ones that did survive and do well, because you have to understand that when I grew up in this country, it was right during the 60s and 70s where drugs were rampant in this country and everybody was using drugs. The teachers, the police officers, the parents, the students, everybody was using drugs. More marijuana in those days. It wasn't heavy drugs today, but there were a lot of people that used heavy drugs from the 60s. But in the 70s, it was a little bit more just marijuana. But I'm continually going to funerals for people that are dying in their 50s that were never able to escape that era. And I think that the church and my Greek heritage saved me from going down that American path where so many youth from the 60s and 70s lost their way because of drugs and not having God in their lives.
Hmm. Um, okay, so next question is what are some of the so you obviously have like a huge influence from your Greek culture and you've been there so you can kind of tell the Greek culture and how it moves along. So having that in mind, how do you see it different, similar with the American culture today and even, as a kid growing up, um, those two?
I think for Greek Americans, their heritage and their church is a big part of their lives. And I don't see that, unfortunately, with a lot of the American youth. They're not heavy into church. They really don't know what their heritage is. I don't know if that bothers them or not. I couldn't tell you. But without my heritage, I would feel totally lost. And I'm making sure that my children have what I didn't have when I was a kid so that they don't um, suffer from an identity crisis when they get older and they'll always know that they have their roots, their church, their family when they need it to keep them strong.
So your wife is of a different culture. Obviously, she's Sorry, you said she was from Costa Rica.
No, I met her in Costa Rica, but my wife is from Argentina.
Okay.
The reason we clicked is because her father is Armenian Orthodox. And as you know, the Armenians and Greeks share a lot of similarities in culture, music, food. So we clicked right away. Um, I felt like she was Greek from the beginning, and she was totally into it, and her father was totally into it, and I clicked right away with her dad. I even made him cry when I asked for her hand in marriage. I went all the way to Argentina to ask for her hand in marriage. Her mother threw a plate at my head, but that's another story. And eventually, the mother came around when my wife gave birth to our first child, Sophia, and she started calling me a saint after that. I won't tell you what she called me before that, but I was a damn Yankee.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So she was Armenian Orthodox, you said. So okay, so that.
My father-in-law was Armenian Orthodox, but being that Argentina is about a 99% Catholic country, and my mother-in-law was French Basque and Northern Italian. My wife and her brother were raised Roman Catholic, but she had no problem with our children being raised Orthodox, and that was very important to me.
Okay, that was my question. um, cool.
Can I?
So yeah, you can add something.
Yeah. The reason I appreciate the Greek Orthodox religion so much, not because I think it's above any other religion, is because what the Greeks have been able to do, which a lot of ethnic groups that come into this country are not able to do, unfortunately, is that they have been able to make the church the centerpiece of the community, where it's not just some place you come on Sunday to worship and then leave. It's so much more than that. The church is the cultural center, it's the religious center, it's where we make friends for life, where we make connections for life. It's a huge part of our lives, and it never stops being a part of our lives because it's first our children, first it's us, then our children, then our grandchildren, and we all stay together, we all stay tight knit, we all go to Greece in the summers if we can afford it, so we never lose our heritage, and that keeps us strong.
That was my next question. It's like you're reading my mind. Good. So what do you see as the biggest challenges facing Greece today?
The biggest challenge facing Greece today is that Greeks, like other Europeans, are forgetting about God. They're losing their way. They're becoming modernized, materialistic. They're following the path of the Americans, the same destructive path. And the Greek Americans are actually more Greek and more religious than most of the Greeks in Greece these days. A lot of the youth are living together without being married. They don't go to church. They're more and more into material things. That's why the economy crashed, because everybody was buying things that they couldn't afford. It's a scary thing that Greece is losing its way when for so many centuries, it was probably, if not the most religious, one of the most religious countries in the world. And I believe that's what always kept uh, Greece in God's graces. And I'm worried about Greece's future now. I think that what they're going through now might be a punishment to wake them up, like what the Jews went through when they turned their backs on God. So I'm very concerned about that.
I have one more question, and then I kind of want to go into what you brought for us today. Um, so what's your reaction towards, if you know anything about the ongoing conflict between Greece and Turkey? Um, Kind of stretches along, but
Well, there's a lot of good Turkish people, and there's a lot of good Greek people. But the biggest problem has always been not really the problem between the two civilizations, but between the governments. Governments cause most of the problems. It's usually political. Um, there's disputed territories that Turkey wants to get their hands on because maybe there's oil or whatever else. And this is going to go on as long as the Jews and Arabs have been going on. Of course, I'm going to be biased um, towards the Greeks, but I think history will show that what the Ottoman Empire did to the Armenians and the Greeks uh, was just as bad as what the Jews went through during their Holocaust. It's not talked about as much because the Turks have denied it, and Europe and the US are allies with Turkey, so they don't want to push the point and make trouble. But what the Turkish government did was horrific, and it's a stain on their culture and on Muslims in general because it makes them look like barbarians and savages. And I don't think that's helping the situation that we have today with Christians and Muslims and Jews getting along. I don't think that that helps at all. The best thing would be to face the history and ask for forgiveness rather than denying it. That just makes it worse.
So, can you explain what you brought?
Well, I brought family history, which is doesn't go back very far because unfortunately, when the Turkish invaded Greece, they tried to destroy the Greek culture and the Greek identity, as they did in other countries during the Ottoman Empire. They were not able to. Greece is still 99% Greek Orthodox, but they had their little schools hiding in the cemeteries that the Turks didn't see so that they could retain the culture and the religion, even though they risked their lives when they did it. Um, Unfortunately, this history doesn't go back very far because the Turks tried to destroy any history that they could, like what they're doing in Cyprus right now. They not only did they take over land from Greeks, but they actually dug up the graves and got rid of the bodies as if to say the Greeks never existed here. And they try to basically wipe out our history. And that's why my history doesn't go back very far. It only goes back to my great grandparents. So I've been told that we were originally from Constantinople, but I'll never really know the truth. And my last name, Dessipris, only exists on the island of Tinos. And we don't know how that could be. And we think it might be that it was actually a Venetian name that got changed into a Greek name, but we'll never know, thanks to the Turks.
So, is that what that article is?
This goes back to my uh, grandparents and I believe maybe their parents, and that's as far as it goes. And it states the birth and death of all my uncles and aunts. As I was saying before, there were 14, and 7 died as infants, and 7 survived.
Oh, okay. Well, do you have anything else to add? I'm pretty,
Um,
pretty
so much,
so much.
but I would be here for hours.
Well,
I
I
didn't mean to paint a bad picture of Greek Americans. There were a lot of Greek Americans that studied and became doctors and lawyers and accountants and never lost their way. I think that a lot of the Greeks that came over here only had a 6th or 8th grade education, and there was no chance for them to go to school. So what they did was they learned how to survive on the streets, and most of them went into the food business. And in order to be able to open up their own businesses, they had to borrow money from people that were not such good people, and they lost their way and developed differently. But I'm going to make sure that my children have the opportunities that my dad didn't have. And even though he lost his way, he still has my respect for trying so hard to give his family a better life. Even though he didn't succeed, he tried really hard, he worked really hard. And if there's anything that I could say about Greeks, it's there's nobody that has a work ethic like Greeks. Nobody. Chinese are about closest, but
just have a
the
lot
Greeks
more.
are the hardest workers.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.